Let me teach you guys a couple of things about parables before we get going. It is commonly thought of in regards to scholarship that parables have only one teaching. So the purpose of a parable is to teach some truth. I'm going to give you guys a little lesson about parables. So here we go, guys. We're going to, boom, I'm on, like, my energy is like through the roof right now. Let me teach you guys a couple of things about parables before we get going. It is commonly thought of in regards to scholarship that parables have only one teaching. So the purpose of a parable is to teach some truth. Do not confuse parables with allegories. Okay? Unless in the text it actually explains to you that it's being used allegorically. So, for example, Jesus gives a parable about, he says, a sower went out to sow a seed. Some fell on rocky ground, some fell on X, Y, and Z. And then he goes on to explain it, and it's very clear that in his explanation, that's an allegory. It's a parable, but it's got allegorical parts to it. So, if we're looking at this parable, we will approach it with what a parable is, and then if the text tells us to do something else with it, we will do that thing. Cool? Okay. Here we go. Mark 12, 1-12. That's the whole parable. Okay? And he began to speak to them in parables. Here we go. That's a key word. It's highlighted. It's what it is. And here's the parable he gave. He says, a man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went away to another country. Okay, so let's just highlight this part or underline it. So this is leased to some tenants. There is a owner to it. Here's what we know about this story so far, this parable. One, there is an owner to it, the man. There's a vineyard. That's important. Let's highlight vineyard. And then it's been rented to some tenants. And then he goes off into another country. When the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent to them another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and they killed him. So it's progressing. They beat the one, they beat the second one worse, and then they killed the third one. And so with many others. Some they beat, and some they killed. This is important. He had still one other, a beloved son. So servants, and then he's got a son. So we're going to highlight the son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. That's the same as the son, the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? So then Jesus gives this parable and then concludes with a question. What will the owner of the vineyard do? And Jesus says, he will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. That is very interesting. And then he quotes a passage. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is a marvelous in our eyes. And verse 12 is very important. It says, and they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them. So, this is what we call internal evidence. The people know that the parable is against them. So who are these people? The people who want to arrest him. Who are the they? It's a very good question. So they leave him alone because they're afraid, but he understands that this parable was a message against them. So let's go back and look at some of the context. So let's maybe scroll back a little bit. Chapter 11. And they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, priests, scribes, and elders are challenging him. And they ask him about his authority, so on and so forth. And then Jesus asks them a question and then says neither. So this passage is directly tied in to chapter 12. Well, why? Because they ask him a question and then he says, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. And then immediately it says, not immediately, but it says, and he began to speak to them in parables. So this is the same context. The people he's speaking to are these people, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Okay? So he knows, they know he's talking about them. So how do they know he's talking about them? Well, this word for vineyard is very interesting. It's very interesting that Jesus uses a vineyard as an example here. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but I'll tell you this, that this word, this thing for vineyard, here, actually there's a good cross-reference here. There's multiple passages in the Old Testament where Israel is referred to as the vineyard. So, Psalm 88, you brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. So Israel is God's vineyard that has been brought out of Egypt and planted in that land, okay? Isaiah 5:1, let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard, okay? Concerning his vineyard, this is, again, my beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. You can go read Isaiah 5. Again, that's a reference to Israel as well. Matthew 21, what do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he went to the first and said, son, go and work in the vineyard. And then these are again, another parable where he uses a vineyard to refer to Israel. So Israel is the vineyard. And at this point, if we're talking about a man planting a vineyard, so there's some allegorical aspects to this text, because now we've seen the representation of Israel being the vineyard. This man, let's just leave it for the man planting it, but it's very clear, I think, from the Old Testament that the man is God who's planted this vineyard, who's fenced it up and took care of it, and it has lended it, has leased it to these tenants. It seems to be the case that according to the perception of the scribes, the Pharisees, and all those guys, the tenants are the religious leaders of Israel. They're supposed to be taking care of Israel. The religious leadership is supposed to be caring for the vineyard, but what they're doing is not. They're essentially taking over this vineyard. And then in this passage, you can go on and explain, like, so it's very easily seen post to that, plus some other passages where all the servants that he sends are the prophets. Right, so he sends these servants, and these are the prophets. And if you look at the Old Testament, the prophets aren't accepted in good ways. Many of them are beheaded and killed. Not many are beheaded. Many are beaten and killed and abused and so on and so forth. And then ultimately, it's the beloved Son who is sent. For God so, sent his only begotten Son. And what do they do with the Son? They say, well, this is the heir. Let's kill him and take his inheritance. And guess what they do? And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. And here's the point of this passage. The man will come, and what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and he will destroy the tenants. So he's going to get rid of the tenants, and then he's going to give the vineyard to others. Essentially, Jesus is saying, it's going to be taken from you guys. It's going to be given to other people. And that's essentially what ended up happening. This caretaking was taken from their responsibility as a religious leader. And I would add on to this that it was given to the Gentiles. It was taken out of Israel. If I want to be contextually correct, that the gospel went out to the Gentiles because of their rejection and the way they treated the Son. The point of this is that the religious leaders are abusing the vineyard that God has given them, and they are not doing and treating it the way they're called to treat it. But I think there's enough internal evidence that this is a parable that very clearly speaks against the religious leaders, and they get that. One of the things that you guys should pay very close attention to is internal evidences within the text. I've seen a lot of Christians read parables like this and then just like misinterpret it, misapply it, and just ruin it. And mostly because they don't know their Old Testament. Mostly because they don't know the sort of language the Old Testament uses, and they don't understand that Jesus is using Old Testament language that the people, that his audience are aware of and know what he's talking about very, very clearly. I would say the key word, the key word in this text is vineyard. And if you don't get that, you're probably going to miss the point, or you're not going to fully understand it. You get enough from it to say, yeah, Jesus is being, he's putting the religious leaders kind of in their place and telling them that the owner is going to come and punish you guys and judge you. But once you understand that vineyard is synonymously used with Israel in the Old Testament, you get how more in your face Jesus is being with these religious leaders, especially because of the earlier question they asked. This is the context. This is the setup for the parable right here. They come to him and said, tell us by what authority you're doing these things. Who gave you this authority? And Jesus says, I'll ask you a question. By whose authority was John baptizing? And then they're like, hey, if we say from heaven, he will say, why did you not believe him? If we say from man, then we're afraid of the people because they thought John was really a prophet. So they say to Jesus, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. And then he goes on to tell them a story in which he tells them that you guys are going to kill me because you guys are these wicked tenants. And the text tells us they want to kill him. Now, if we continue to read more, and when you read the Gospel of Mark, you see, and you read the Gospels, you see exactly them doing that. They end up killing Jesus.